to our beginning session 2. And let me announce the first talk. Kyle Marquardt, Modeling Language Trends and Language Policy in the Former Soviet Union. Please, you have the floor.
Excellent. Let me please share my screen. I will assume that everyone can see everything and hear me unless I'm told otherwise. So if you have problems hearing me or seeing my screen, please let me know now.
Okay.
Great. Cool. So it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you all today. So just to preface my talk a little bit, I'm sort of a double outsider here in the sense that many of you obviously know a lot more about regional language issues than I do in the Russian Federation and elsewhere. And then on top of that, I'm also a political scientist and a statistician by training, which means that with a lot of focus on measurement, which means that obviously this is coming from a slightly different perspective than a lot of other speakers here, which to me means that I have a whole lot to learn. And I'm really excited to hear your feedback on this. And hopefully you find this presentation and the sort of work that I'm presenting interesting and potentially of use and potential source for collaboration in the future. So the impetus for this project is as follows, and something that I probably don't need to justify too much is that understanding language policy is fundamental to language revitalization, language stabilization, and language development. But the key issue that I'm going to be discussing here is that actually assessing language policy requires very specific forms of data. So it is first and foremost, regardless of what type of methodology you're using, necessary to know the degree to which language use has changed over time. So if you want to make a claim about how language X has changed, you need to know where language X was at time 0 and at time 1. And equally importantly, you actually need to know this using the same measure. So if you only have data on, say, native language in time 0 and only data on language use in school at time 1, you can't actually assess whether or not the intervention or the language policy actually did anything to the language in the sense that you have incompatible data. On top of this, and one thing that I focus on, and again, this is where my sort of disciplinary background comes into play, is that if we're trying to assess the impact of a language policy, it's necessary to note the degree to which this change compares to other comparable situations. So for example, if you pass legislation that promotes a language and within 20 years you see a 5% increase in the proportion of the population that speaks that language, that might be evidence that your language policy worked. On the other hand, it's possible that in other regions without this intervention, you also see the same increase, which means that actually assessing whether or not it's perhaps evidence that your language intervention did not actually change language practice, but rather something else happening with demographics or something else actually was the thing that mattered. Similarly, if you have a language intervention or a policy and the proportion of speakers of that language decreases by 5%, maybe that's evidence that your intervention failed. But if similar regions have a 20% decrease, then that indicates that perhaps your intervention actually was worthwhile. So all of this speaks to the need for data that are both comparable across time and across space about language. The problem is that linguistic data are often inconsistent across time and space. So and I'll be discussing this particular context in the Russian situation and the post-Soviet context a little bit later on. But basically, the way people measure language varies. Sometimes they use censuses, sometimes they use surveys, sometimes they ask about native language, sometimes they just ask about ethnic identity. And this all varies across time and across space, which means that actually doing the type of analysis that I discussed a little bit earlier is very, very difficult. Building onto this problem is that the most consistent data about things related to language are often the worst ways of actually measuring language. So for example, one thing I'm going to be talking a lot about in this lecture or this discussion is this idea of ethnic identity, which is often correlated with language trends. So if you want to know whether or not the proportion of speakers of a language is increasing or decreasing in a territory, it's like the proportion of people who identify with that group is often a good proxy for it. However, obviously that has nothing to do with language by actual language use. So for example, it's very possible to be a Kazakh and not speak Kazakh, very possible to be a Tatar and not speak Tatar, and so forth. So the data that we have the most consistent information about, namely ethnic identity, is often not a good measure for what we're actually interested in. So what I'm proposing is a statistical model that deals with some of these problems. So specifically, it makes some assumptions about how language changes. And these are one things that I'm really hoping to discuss with you guys in detail during this presentation, how much these assumptions match the sort of realities. And then iteratively estimates the relationship between different measures of language and the structural model. So basically what the model does is it guesses how many people speak a language at a given point in time, and then tracks and then uses that guess to estimate how reliable different sources of data are, and then uses these measures of reliability to then come up with a better guess of the proportion of speakers of language over time. And it does this a whole lot of times using simulation methods. So this is very abstract. Obviously, I'll get into a little bit more detail. Now, the thing that this model does is it provides a proportion of titular language speakers across time and space. Now, I'm going to be calling this titular language speakers, or often I'm going to be referring to this as spoken proficiency or fluency. Obviously, it is not actually that. So in the sense that it's an aggregation of all the different data that I'm presenting today in this discussion. So I'm glossing it into something, so technically it's a latent variable measure of language proficiency, which is a mouthful, so I'm just going to be referring to this as the proportion of speakers. But bear in mind that this is not actually measuring exactly what this is, but it's measuring this concept with some degree of error. And then it also provides estimates of language status for different regions, ethno-federal regions of the former Soviet Union across time and across space, looking at the status in the early Soviet period, the late Soviet period, and in the post-Soviet period. The other thing that I should note here is that I am looking at ethno-federal regions of the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet area. This is not for any sort of political reason or anything like that, but simply because those are the data that I have available to me. So the way the census data from the Soviet Union was recorded makes it very easy to get titular language speakers from, say, Tatarstan, from Kabardino-Balkaria, from Kalmykia, from Kazakhstan, from Belarus. That actually gives us a little bit of comparability, which is going to be key to my modeling process. So here I'm going to be talking about ethno-federal regions, many of which are now republics in Russia or autonomous okrugs, but this is, so these are sort of the observation level that I'm going to be discussing. So before I can get into the model, I wanted to briefly mention why this is an issue. And the sort of the issue is that we have very consistent data from the Soviet period about language trends. However, these data are not particularly exactly what we would want them to be. So from all the Soviet censuses, we have data on ethnic identity. So the proportion of people in these different regions that identify with a given group or the titular group of this territory. So Tatars in Tatarstan, Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, et cetera. And for many of them, we also have data on native language. Native language is getting closer to this idea of language in that it has language in it. So родной язык is what I'm discussing here. But there's also a fair amount of evidence that people understood this measure very differently across time and across space. So some people interpret it as a question of what language are you most familiar with. Some people interpret it as the language of your group. So if you're Tatar, your native language is Tatar, even if you don't speak a word of Tatar. Toward after the 70s, we also have data on a second language spoken fluently. This is obviously actually sort of exactly what I would want to be measuring. The trick is that you have to use it in conjunction with the data on native language. So you couldn't declare your native language as also a second language you spoke fluently, because the way the census was designed was assuming that the native language was actually a measure of fluency, which means that these data are also somewhat complicated. So from the Soviet period, we have consistent data, but not necessarily the best data that we would want to have. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we have good news and bad news for linguistic data. The good news is that a lot of censuses started asking better questions about language. So the Russian census of 2010, and I think in 2021, has good questions about fluency and other aspects. Russia has also pursued these micro-censuses, which ask a lot of fine-grained questions about language, which can give us a lot of leverage about language practice and language use. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the data become much more inconsistent. So the policies pursued by the Russian Federation differ from those pursued by Moldova, differ from those pursued by Uzbekistan, which has yet to conduct a census, which means that we have less consistency across language measures, across time and across space, which creates a huge inferential problem if we're trying to actually compare trends from these different countries and from different regions within different countries. On top of this, we also have additional data sources, which I'd be happy to discuss in greater detail during the question and answer. One thing that I do want to highlight is that, again, because of my background, I have a lot of access to data gathered by Western researchers. I'd be really interested in your thoughts and your recommendations for data that I could be looking at that are sort of comparable within specific regions or across regions in Russia, because the modeling process that I'm using requires a whole lot of data to actually function. So this is very abstract, but this is what I mean in practice. And this is actually kind of a good situation in the sense that here we're showing data from Kazakhstan. And on the vertical axis, we have the proportion of people in Kazakhstan or the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic for most of the time in the earlier periods of an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, but the territory that is now Kazakhstan, who report report different aspects of Kazakh identity, including language. And so yellow represents those who report it as being their native language. Purple represents ethnic identity, so the proportion of people who identify Kazakh as their ethnic identity. And what's interesting here is that you see very close relationship, as we'd expect, across time and across space between these two measures. Overlaid here is also the proportion of people who report Kazakh as a second language they spoke fluently, plus native language. So these data all sort of agree with each other, tell us a roughly similar story. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, you have a bunch of problems with data. So in the 1999 Kazakhstani census, you have a question about native language, but you don't have this question about fluency in a second language. And then in later censuses, they got rid of even the native language question, at least as something that you could declare for different types of languages. And it was replaced with a bunch of other questions about levels of fluency, which again are potentially better measures of linguistic practice, but are incomparable to data that came before that. On the other hand, we have data from the World Values Survey, which is represented here by triangles, which tells us a slightly different story. So for example, we have this question of language spoken at home, which indicates that the proportion of people who speak Kazakh regularly is different than the statistics that you get from something like ethnic identity. So what you have here is evidence that all the data are sort of pointing in the same direction, but especially in the late 2000s, or not the late 2000s, but in the early to mid 2000s, you have a whole lot of divergence in the actual data that are available, which means that it's a lot more difficult to estimate how the Kazakh language has changed over time. If we look at a place like Belarus, we see even more sort of difficulty. So for example, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, so in independent Belarus, you see evidence that the proportion of people who identify as ethnic Belarusians has increased, but data on language, especially those from that actually ask about language use, indicate that the proportion of Belarusian speakers is much lower than you would get from these questions about fluency or native language, and are actually showing a different pattern than what you'd get from ethnic identity. If you go into Russia, we see similar issues. So here is data from Kalmykia. And what we see here is actually after the disintegration of the Soviet Union from the 1990s to the 2000s, evidence that the proportion of people who identify with the Kalmyk ethnic group has increased. Similarly, the proportion of people who identify with the Kalmyk language as a native language has also increased. However, questions from the microcensuses and the 2010 census indicate that potentially actual fluency in the language is much lower than would be evidenced by the proportion of people who speak it as a native language or as being ethnic Kalmyk. So what we have here is different stories coming from different data that you have. So the model that I'm going to be discussing is based on a model proposed by Abrams and Strogatz in a Science article in 2003, which basically proposes a structural model of language change. And what this means is that the assumption of the model is going to be that languages change as a function of demographics as well as language status. Now, what demographics are is basically this idea from sort of economics that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So if you have a lot of people who speak a language, it means that it's going to be that the trends, and it means that the model is going to assume that trends will trend upwards, all things being equal. And if there are very few speakers of a language, trends are going to go downwards. So if very few people speak a language, it's going to be difficult to like based on pure demographics, to convince people to learn the language. However, this model also incorporates something that I'm calling language status, which is basically a measure of the degree to which a change in language is potentially not attributable to demographics, but rather to some sort of countervailing force. So for example, if you have very few speakers of a language, but a really high status language, then you could actually have an increasing proportion of people who speak that language. So this sort of very simple model is going to underlie another model, which is actually going to be taking these different data from different sources that I discussed earlier, and then using the sort of assumptions of this model to estimate how reliable different sources of information about language are, and then is going to be feeding that back in to estimate both language and the status of a language. So this is all just going to be sort of an iterative process where everything is going to be sort of estimated together. So the way that this model works is sort of as follows. I'm not going to belabor the point too much because I don't think we need to go over like a lot of the math. But again, the idea here is what I was discussing earlier, which is that language change is going to be a function of the number of people who don't speak the language, who start speaking the language, and the proportion of people who speak the language and stop speaking it, which is going to be a function of both the proportion of speakers of that language as well as the period and the status of that language in different periods. So here, arbitrarily, I chose 3 periods, and it's unique for each region. So the status of the Tatar language is different in Tatarstan across 3 different periods. Same with Kazakh, it has a unique language parameter. That is what it looks like all written out. The factor analysis is basically a way of saying that all of these different measures I discussed, so native language, ethnic identity, language spoken at home, language in which you're fluent, are all measuring a similar construct, but with different degrees of error. So again, ethnic identity isn't actually about language, so it's going to be estimated with a huge amount of error. Whereas something like what language do you speak fluently is exactly what I'm trying to measure, so it has relatively low error. And then also the idea is that some languages might be, some measures might be overestimating or underestimating linguistic proficiency, and these are what these alpha and these beta parameters are doing. So what does this actually do? So this is what the model output for Kazakhstan looks like. And what the model output is these purple line with vertical lines. And these vertical lines are uncertainty estimates. So basically, it's saying that my best guess about the proportion of people who spoke Kazakh fluently, again, not exactly fluency, but like the measure that I'm using in my model or the concept that I'm measuring, is probably a little bit less than 50% in 1926, the 1926 census, but there's a fair amount of uncertainty. So it might be somewhere between 55% and something like 40%. And then what you see is that the data tracks very closely with the linguistic data, as you'd expect. And then after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, so in the 1990s and 2000s, evidence that the Kazakh language use has increased or proficiency has increased on average in Kazakhstan, but with a fair amount of uncertainty. So these vertical lines get a lot bigger because we have new data and less comparable data with the past. With Belarus, what you see is the data is the model is very much discounting the changes in ethnic identity in Belarus and more putting a lot more weight on the data about language use, as well as the trends in the linguistic data. So estimating that after independence, the proportion of speakers of Belarusian has decreased in Belarus. And in Kalmykia, you see sort of a similar trend based on these model estimates, that is weighting the data from the Soviet census, the Russian census of 2010 about linguistic fluency, as well as the data language spoken at home from the microcensus to indicate that actually the proportion of speakers of Kalmyk has been decreasing, though not necessarily to as great an extent as some might fear. We can also do this with other cases. So here is the evidence from Tatarstan, where actually a lot of the data agree to a much greater extent than in other places. So basically showing that that the proportion of speakers of Tatar has increased since the 1990s. And what makes this model sort of cool is that now we can actually look at trends across regions using the model estimates, which in principle are going to be giving us consistent data across time and across space. So here are the trends in the Volga republics, where you see evidence that the Chuvash language, for example, decreased during the Soviet period and is roughly stabilized after the 1990s. So the Tatar language in Tatarstan has increased after the 1990s. Same with Bashkir, and then you have the exception of Udmurt, which indicates that it's the proportion of speakers of Udmurt has been decreasing. So I'm running out of time, but I'm happy to discuss some of the estimates of language status that come out of this model during the question and answer. Also, the degree to which different measures of language have different levels of error. And so just briefly to conclude is that I think that this model shows a fair amount of promise It's still like in sort of my plea, and what I'd really like helpful with here is that this model is only as good as the data that I put into it. So obviously it's not creating things out of thin air. And so if people have ideas for different data sources, different modifications, I'd be really interested in hearing that. The big output from the factor analysis is that the language of everyday use is a really good measure of latent concept of language, language fluency that I'm measuring here. And then here are some issues that I've been dealing with my modeling strategy that I would also be happy to discuss. Again, I think I am now exactly out of time, so I'd be happy to discuss those in question and answer or anything else that people are interested in. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Okay, thanks so much, Kyle, for bringing in this statistician's perspective to our conference. And I think the first question is by Michał Paradowski.
Right. Hi. Thanks a lot for that, Kyle. It's nice to see Abrams and Strogatz being quoted. I was wondering, I may have missed that, but whether you think that the model would perhaps make more visible predictions concerning the change after the fall of the Soviet Union if you narrowed down the results just to the younger generations, those that are much more likely to exhibit a shift in the nominal language or a shift in the language in which they are going to bring up their children rather than the population across the board?
Well, I think so. This is a really good question. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in sort of modifications going forward is whether or not it makes sense to look at the overall population. So another option, and something that I discussed with colleagues a while ago, was whether or not I should actually not just be focusing on titular languages, but the proportion of people of a given group who speak the language. So the proportion of Tatars in Tatarstan who speak the Tatar language would be another way of looking at something like this. But not the question you asked. So the question you asked, which is about like new generations, is definitely something that would be something that I'm definitely trying to incorporate to a greater extent in the model. Again, something that I'd want more information about. So one of the tricks about this model is this idea of status, which is something that ideally would change relatively quickly. So in the sense that I currently have like these 3 blocks of statuses for each region, which is obviously not reflecting how quickly language policy can change and the way that language policy can change. But the other trick about the status is that language policy takes a while to actually really work. So especially when we're talking about school-age children, if you have an intervention that increases the proportion of people who start learning the language in school, it's going to take a long time for that actually to be reflected in data at the population level. And so in some ways, the status indicators are kind of a lagged indicator that is difficult to sort of conceptualize and then operationalize, but something that I think would definitely be worth thinking about a little bit more in the future. And then restricting the model to like different generations would also be something that would potentially be doable. However, especially with Soviet data, so I think there are more fine-grained data available, especially from Russia, where I could actually do that. But like when we go back to the Soviet period, incorporating that sort of information from the census would be sort of a data issue that I think would be difficult.
Thank you.
I think there is time for one more really quick question, if there is one. There is a question in the chat by Camilo. Can you see it, Kyle?
Yeah. So attitudes toward transmission is definitely is unfortunately something that I can't incorporate into the, well, so it's something that I can incorporate into the model, but I haven't as of yet. So actually that is a really interesting thing to potentially put into the model. So I do have data from some sources, so like the Colton and Huff surveys, which asked people in 16 different regions of Russia, do you think that people in your region should learn X language? And so incorporating that would be a really good potential way of adding additional data about these attitudes, and then seeing how well they actually correlate with actual language change would be something that would be really interesting. So the answer is no, I have not done that yet, but I would definitely be interested in working on it in the future. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank Kyle for his very interesting presentation.
Thank you all very much.
And now we switch to the second paper in this session. It's by Michał Paradowski, The Chances and Challenges of Pedagogical Translanguaging in South Africa. Please, Michał.
Thank you very much. Wasz jest spasibo, Andrzej. Dobry dzień, dobre jutro. I'm here in Switzerland. Сейчас тут еще утро. Nice to see some familiar faces as well that I haven't seen for a number of years, and as well as new ones. All right, so I'll be focusing on the educational context of South Africa, but that is going to serve as a stepping stone for a more general discussion on the limitations and caveats to pedagogical translanguaging in contexts that are inherently heteroglossic. So if anyone here is familiar with the educational realities of South Africa, then you may be aware of the fact that throughout apartheid, the languages, and at least the African languages, were separated, as well as the student groups were separated, until the more progressive language policies of the recent few decades, which assume that students should be proficient and educated in at least 3 languages, and that means that at least one African language is going to take a prominent role in the education. However, that is not, despite the expectations, that is not exactly what takes place, and that is not exactly the situation that we're dealing with. So numerous studies have shown that pupils lack adequate reading comprehension, and that's irrespective of the language in which they are being tested, and the scores actually deteriorate as you move up the educational ladder. And as many as 80% of learners are unable to retrieve basic information to answer simple questions, with the result that South Africa ranks at the bottom of the African League, so to say. This is especially a problem in rural and township schools. And there are a number of reasons that the educational woes could be chalked down to. So one is that despite this formal recognition of 11 official languages in South Africa, and the right of the children to attain education in their home languages, once you go to grade 4, instruction is carried out mostly either in English or in Afrikaans, that for most pupils is not their home language. For many pupils, actually, it's not even going to be their second language, but it may be a third or a further one, especially children that are, for instance, from migration backgrounds. And actually, English is not the home language for many of the African teachers either. An added and even more serious complication is that as you look at the ladder and the stages of education that students have to go through, you see that there are numerous transition points of the language of instruction. For instance, it may first be an African home language for the first 3 or 4 years, that then may switch to Afrikaans, and that then is going to switch to English. And if you look on the right-hand side of the column, then you're going to see that sometimes the policy expectations of the first additional language are rather unrealistic, because you're getting, for instance, 1.5 up to 2 hours of the home language, and then 24 minutes only of the additional language per day. And that is expected to bring you up to around 2,000 words in the foreign language or the first additional language by the end of grade 3. And then when you go to grade 4, over the scope of just 1 school year, you're expected to have acquired a further 3,000 words, at least, plus a further 1,200 new words. This is hardly something that can be achieved in the circumstances. There are further challenges in the educational context that span from patchy linguistic policies and their implementation to the multiplicity of languages in the classroom, where often teachers will not share any African language with a major share of their students. The teachers themselves are not necessarily of South African extraction. There are some that, for instance, immigrate from Zimbabwe. That's the probably #1 source of immigrant teachers. And then for students who have a migration background and a migration experience, that is something that's obviously quite traumatic. On top of that, they need to deal with and tackle racism and xenophobia on the part of their classmates. That doesn't necessarily help in the acquisition of the language. And then the class size is also an issue. So on average, there are 29 learners per teacher in a typical South African classroom. So these are some challenges that are specific to the South African context, but there are also more that are more universal as long as you're looking at a situation with multiple languages in class. So of course, here in this audience, we don't need to explain that we're living in times when contact between people of diverse cultures and languages has been enhanced, and this also translates into the classrooms of today, which are often melting pots of students from various language backgrounds. And those are typically students who are at the same time acquiring the language of instruction as well as their home languages. And policy expectations are usually idealistic, and they don't match the reality of many students not having developed requisite proficiency in the target language to cope with the discourse that they encounter in the language classroom. And that means that assessment that's typically administered in only one language cannot properly gauge the competence of the students or their progress. At the same time, the language policies and expectations of, for instance, Anglo-normativity in countries where English is the language of instruction and the medium of instruction assume rather ideal schooling scenarios. And also mean that the language of learning and teaching often serves as a gatekeeping device. And that in turn means that the issue is not just an educational issue, but also a social justice issue, especially in countries that have a colonial history. So a term and concept that becomes very handy in this context is that of translanguaging and transsemiotizing. Now, one problem with the label is that the notion has been used to refer to at least 4 different phenomena or aspects of translanguaging, and authors don't necessarily always take the trouble to explain what they have in mind. So translanguaging can refer to speakers' natural cognitive capacity and drive to draw on all the semiotic resources at their disposal. It may refer to the observable manifestations of these practices that you may have found across individuals and societies around the world that will often use multiple languages and semiotic systems within the span of a few minutes without really bothering much which one they are taking from, as long as it serves the purpose of communication. It may also refer to what's going to be the focus of the remainder of this talk, that is a plurilingual pedagogy, where the language of instruction is often different from the home languages of the learners. And it can also refer to an ontological orientation that criticizes ideals and ideologies such as monolingualism as the individual or societal norm, or ideas of standard and prestige, for instance, different prestige of languages. So at this point, translanguaging should be distinguished from code switching, in that it doesn't just look at or focus on the codes that are used in a communicative episode and the identification thereof, but tries instead to focus on the users, language users, their agency, their sense and meaning making practices, and see the users as agents. Moreover, many of the translanguaging practices that are encountered cannot easily be assigned to just one or the other language, and you sometimes have to see both in order to make meaning. So, as such, translanguaging rejects the myth of monolingualism as the norm and views of language diversity as something that's not desired, and dominant language policies such as, for instance, English only. Through that, it also does away with the conventional practice of the separation of languages and what Jim Cummins calls the two solitudes premise, that is the idea that bi- and multilinguals are storing their languages as discrete entities. So in education, as I said, it tries to do away with target language only policies, as well as bilingual immersion programs that do allow two languages, but still try to keep them separate. So there will be a time in the day where one language is going to be used. There's a time in the day when another language is to be used, but typically there's not a lot of room for mixing. Translanguaging tries to go counter to that idea. So as such, it typically not only allows, but encourages teachers to actively draw on all students' semiotic repertoires, that is to go beyond the acceptance and tolerance of multiple languages to the cultivation thereof. And the idea is that by doing so, it helps students acquire not just the target language and the language of instruction, but also the home languages at the same time. And the rationale is that by doing so, this will enable students to participate in the lesson, even if their current proficiency in the language of instruction may not otherwise allow that. So the introduction of the term in Western scholarship basically recognized what has been going on for centuries in communities and families around the world. It's just that now it became part and parcel of language classrooms. And the argumentation behind this introduction was, or one that has been often raised by Ofelia Garcia and colleagues, for instance, is that by giving voice and the choice of languages to the students, it has a transformative and liberating potential, especially for students who would otherwise not see themselves in the educational system. But despite all the advocates of translanguaging and the topic becoming one that's really en vogue today, practically every applied linguistics conference these days is going to include a session or at least some papers devoted to the concept of translanguaging. And this is not a concept without problems and caveats. So let's look and interrogate some of these. So one problem is that instead of removing existing hierarchies and practices, the introduction of a new language, a new home language as a possible medium of instruction in a classroom that is heteroglossic may simply replace the old hierarchies with new ones. And thus it may unintentionally reproduce disadvantages and reinforce inequalities and hegemonies of some languages over others. The quote at the bottom illustrates how parents may approach the same language policy differently depending on the perceived status of the languages. This actually ties nicely with Kyle's presentation before mine. So the solutions where a mainstream home language is selected as a possible language of instruction that's next to the main language of instruction, may not be so effective and viable in contexts that are not bilingual, but multilingual, and where there's an imbalance of languages. Also, actually, not all learners appreciate the opportunity to use their home language. Studies carried out, for instance, in the United States showed that Latino students, some of them appreciated opportunities such as concurrent translation, but many others were dissatisfied with the amount of the pedagogical use of Spanish, and especially language singletons who were in the class. They were finding themselves surrounded by a language that they had not signed up to learn and were not communicative in. Another example comes from this year's project carried out in Canada, where students were very reluctant to use their home languages, even though the teacher was trying to cajole them into doing so. Another problem that is admittedly more of a logistic and classroom management nature than related to language of instruction is that teachers may feel uncomfortable when confronted with communication that they cannot understand. Though, of course, this is something that may also happen if students switch into a jargon of the mainstream language. So it's not a problem that's inherent in translanguaging only. On a practical and logistic level, in many contexts, the demographics of the teachers don't align with those of the student population. And we've seen that one of prime examples is, for instance, South Africa. Plus, usually translanguaging implicitly, sometimes explicitly assumes that the home language of the students is their strongest language, and that is not always the case. So studies, for instance, from Luxembourg show that the switch to the learner's home language in the classroom may actually cause confusion and more effort of them than if the instruction had been carried out in the dominant language. Also, there's still quite a bit of resistance to the ideas of translanguaging from other stakeholders, such as other teachers, parents, educational institutions. So teachers and students who may be invested in the concept still have to face that resistance and opposition. Another issue that has to be raised is the implicit and sometimes explicit assumption that the introduction of the home languages as the language of instruction in the classroom and the language of communication in the classroom are going to lead to improved well-being, educational outcomes, amelioration of achievement disparities, and the solution of many other problems. And that if these problems persist, that is because the students were not afforded the opportunity to use their home languages. But such philosophy or such argumentation basically means that we're trying to find an easy solution or silver bullet to existing woes, whereas in practice, the only thing that the introduction of another language may change is the languages that are used for communication in the classroom. There is now actually mounting evidence showing that translanguaging doesn't always work, or that it doesn't work everywhere, and that students need not necessarily find it liberating, and that sometimes it can actually cause a decrease in well-being. Then there's the necessity of looking at not just content subjects, but also language subjects, so language classes. And there it is important, of course, for the instructor to devote sufficient time to providing both input and output and practice opportunities in the target language. So that means that within the limited contact hours that are available, whereas one may have the ideals of translanguaging in the back of their minds, it is still necessary to keep the languages separate and to provide enough exposure and opportunities for practice. Otherwise, again, studies have shown that an overuse of other languages may not lead the students to the level of proficiency that is going to be required of them at the end of the road, for instance, for graduation or for continuing study via the medium of that language. One risk here, for instance, is that techniques such as concurrent translation may make some students tune out when instruction is carried out in the target language, because then they know that they can simply wait for a translation to come in a language that is easier to them. So where the aim of and goal of acquisition is a language, it actually does make sense to keep it separate, especially as at the end of the road, most students will be evaluated for the skills in only one language. So to conclude, it's important that pedagogical practices should not be eclipsed by negative stereotypes about, for instance, multilingualism and by language hierarchies and ideologies. And if those plurilingual practices are going to be successful, then the students can carry them outside of the classroom. But at the same time, teachers should resist this temptation to carry out solutions that worked in other environments to their own, because instruction should always be tailored to the ecology of the classroom and the needs and abilities of the students. And that means that, for instance, what works in a bilingual setting may not work in a multilingual one. And lastly, in the context where one of the languages of instruction is English, and the realization that over 80% of communication in this language today does not involve native speakers of this language, and that for most users of this language and learners of this language, they're going to use it to communicate with other non-natives like themselves, the attention shifts away from standards and norms, prescriptive norms, towards facility in and intelligibly conveying and comprehending information. This was based on two papers. One is in press, the other has been resubmitted after review that address those concepts at length. If anyone's interested, I can share them with you. And then if I could just use 20 seconds to advertise a study that we're carrying out at the moment. The project received ethics clearance, is pre-registered with investigating how learners' personality traits influence the effectiveness of their online versus face-to-face language learning. If you know anyone who has recently or is learning a foreign language, whether online or in face-to-face scenarios, and could share the link, would be very grateful. I'm going to post it in the chat. So thank you very much for your attention. Большое спасибо за внимание, and I'll be happy to take a question if there's time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Michał. Very interesting questions, please. Comments. Ekaterina, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I have more comment than a question. I'm in parallel listening to another session. There is a big discussion about ongoing, I mean, for many years, discussion about using dialects in school environment. And I think your model, which you're talking about, is very suitable for using different varieties in the school context with some kind of standard, which is not known to many of students and which they see as a foreign language. That will be kind of not translanguaging, but transdialectal, or whatever we call it. But I think this is what we need nowadays. And the same probably with the pluricentric languages, which are taught everywhere in the world, like also in the class context. So I think this is the only way out nowadays with respect to the languages which are on the verge of extinction. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. So yes, I can give. So I'm now in Bern, and I can give an example from a bilingual school in the town of Biel-Bienne, where in the first half year, most of instruction is either in French or in German, but the German for the first half year is Swiss German, and it's only later that they switch to Hochdeutsch, because the Swiss German is the language of the kindergarten, of the playground, the language of the street, and the one that children typically speak at home. So absolutely, the inclusion of languages, as long as it can help, is certainly something that can be considered.
Well, very quick question, Kyle, and very quick answer, please.
Okay. Yeah. So this is actually sort of a basic question, which is like, are there particular contexts, so particular subject areas in which translanguaging works better than others? So, or is this something that you believe has to be incorporated at all levels of the course? And so what I mean by this is like, would you recommend something like translanguage, or like, obviously like situations vary across contexts, but like, is translanguaging better for something like a literature course than say for a math course, than for say a chemistry course? Or what are the different sort of contexts in which translanguaging is better or worse in terms of actually educating in the topic?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kyle. That's a very interesting question. I haven't come across studies that will compare it. One of the problems with translanguaging literature is that it's often not comparative, doesn't typically have an experimental and a control group. It usually only has a translanguaging group and then makes statements on the basis of observation or questionnaires afterwards, but it doesn't really include a rigorous comparative component. But this would certainly be something worth investigating, whether, for instance, STEM subjects versus humanities or social sciences work better in translanguaging scenarios or not. Certainly very interesting research.
Okay, thanks very much, Michał, for your talk. And let's move on to the final paper in this session by Olga Kazakevich. And the title of the paper is Regional Language Policy in the Russian Federation and the Degree of its Influence on the Functioning of Autochthonous Minority Languages.
Yes, thank you. Well, now. Okay. Yes, it's seen, yes. Thank you. And I'm glad to be able to speak here. So I'll speak about regional policy concerning languages, autochthonous minority languages, actually. One moment. Hopefully it will turn. Yes, it works, okay. Well, I'll say a couple of words about the problem, then I'll say something about regional documents, just because there are lots of regional documents concerning languages, and they are really nice ones. And I'll say something about regional projects aimed at supporting minority languages. And then I'll analyze the outcomes of these projects and of the nice papers, documents, laws adopted up to now. Well, so current language policy in the Russian Federation is formed both at the federal and at the regional level. And it is, or at least it should be, intended to become a reference point in solving the problems of the preservation and development of multilingualism as one of the most important components of the national heritage, harmonizing the use of the languages of these people, of the peoples of Russia, ensuring a high level of the acquisition of the national language by all the citizens of the country, but not instead of their ethnic languages, but along with them, supporting the languages of the Russian Federation that are endangered in the first line. That's what we should like to have. At the regional level, the development of language policy takes place not only institutionally by the authorities, through the adoption of regional laws or regulations, but also spontaneously on the initiative of groups of regional residents or individual activists. It's an important thing, really. Then the objective of the paper, it is supposed to consider regional practices and initiatives of the last 20 years on the formulation of language policy in relation to autochthonous languages in several regions of the Russian Federation, situated in Siberia and the Far East, and to analyze the actual implementation of this policy and to identify its advantages and limitations. The analyzed data consists of the language legislation of the relevant regions, official information on the functioning of the local autochthonous languages in education and culture, the results of sociolinguistic surveys, then from the one side, and from the other side, the results of sociolinguistic surveys led on the territories of the regions, interviews with representatives of autochthonous minorities, including language activists, monitoring of new initiatives of regional institutions and citizens, including those in the internet sphere. And finally, the results of the consideration of the projects funded in the regions, which were positioned as contributing to support and preservation of endangered languages. So here are the regions. Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Area. There are 4 languages there. The languages which are called in Russian языки коренных малочисленных народов, and in English it might be put as autochthonous minority languages, something like that. Well, here are the 4 languages: Tundra Nenets, Forest Nenets, Northern Hunt and Northern Selkup, then Krasnoyarsk territory. There are 9 autochthonous minority languages, or indigenous languages, if you like. Tundra Nenets, Tundra Enets, Forest Enets, Nganasan, Selkup, Ketev, Kidolgan, and Chulim. The languages belong to different language families. Khabarovsk territory, 8 languages: Evenkev, Negidal, Nanayul, Chau, Dihe, Nif, and Oroch. There is this language is not spoken anymore, unfortunately, but in the documents it is still included in the texts of the documents of Khabarovsk territory. Then Tomsk region, there are 3 languages: Southern Selkup, Eastern Hunt, and Chulim, and the Irkutsk region, 2 languages: Evenki and Tofa. And lastly, Sakhalin region, 4 languages: Nif, Khoro, Kulta, Evenki, and Nanai. And here in the map, and here we have Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Area here. Then Krasnoyarsk territory, Khabarovsk territory, Tomsk district, Irkutsk district, and Amur. Oh, sorry, Irkutsk district and Sakhalin district, no Amur district at all. And once again, the map of the languages. So the languages are shown here. And I must say that the choice of the territories, these territories were chosen because I worked in all of them. I did my fieldwork in all of them. So I know the situation there, and I can judge the implementation of the formulated policies. Language laws. So only in three regions there are proper language laws. Language laws were adopted. It's in Sakhalin region, and it was adopted, well, 13 years ago. The Sakhalin region law on languages. Then in Yamal-Nenets autonomous area, law on native languages or of the autochthonous minorities of the north. And in Krasnoyarsk territory, the Krasnoyarsk territory law on native or ethnic languages of the autochthonous minorities residing in Krasnoyarsk territory. What is meant under languages of autochthonous minorities or native ethnic languages? It's from the law of Yamal-Nenets autochthonous area. Well, languages are an integral part of the existence, culture, and traditional way of life of the autochthonous minorities of the North and are used in everyday communication. These languages are used in everyday communication, and in some public spheres, they are recognized as local official languages in the places of residence of these peoples and are used on an equal basis with the state language of the Russian Federation. That's Yamal-Nenets language law. Great, I think it's well said, well formulated, but it doesn't work, unfortunately. And here are some points concerning the development and use of native languages, again from the Yamal-Nenets language law, autonomous area language law. In the autonomous area, in order to preserve, study, and develop autochthonous minority languages, district target programs are developed, approved, and implemented in accordance with the procedure established by the legislation of the autonomous area, which may include those programs. Development of measures for the use of native languages in public life, the gradual expansion of their social and cultural functions. Great, I think. Provision of appropriate material and technical support for educational institutions, providing instruction in native languages. Introduction of a system of continuous teaching of native languages in appropriate educational institutions. All that sounds really great. This law was adopted in 2010, yes, 2010. 11 years 11 years since the adoption of this law, whether we have anything of the kind. Well, organizing courses for advanced training of preschool and school teachers of minority languages, training specialists in the field of mass media able to speak minority languages, financing mass media in minority languages, compilation and publication of curriculum, textbooks, manuals, and dictionaries, publication of fiction in native languages, promoting the development of contacts of indigenous minorities of the region with minorities in other regions and other countries speaking the same or related languages, supporting research in the field of linguistics, culture, history, folklore, ethnography, of indigenous peoples of the region, and other measures promoting the preservation and development of minority languages. Well, and let's just see into the language law of the Krasnoyarsk territory. It was adopted in 2011. No, practically the same points, they are very much alike, creating conditions for the use of native languages in various spheres of public relations, promoting the revival of native language, and so on and so on. If at least the 10th part of that were realized by now, well, we wouldn't lose language speakers. And during the last 10 years, well, all the languages of these six regions lost their speakers. Practically all but Nenets, both Nenets languages, have very little or absolutely no children speaking the language. So the language language transmission was broken, well, in different times, in different local communities, but no new speakers appear. Well, just all sounds great. And in 2017, all the 6 regions adopted special, programs promoting autochthonous minority languages on their territories. These programs consist of many sort of events, how it is called, events, and then these events are not, or practically not, connected with each other. So according to these programs, the events are to be organized, then to be implemented, and they are passed, the following event comes, and so on. Well, that is why these programs are really nice, but the problem is that they practically do not work. Just to implement teaching languages in every place where indigenous people reside. The number of schools where indigenous languages were taught diminished during the last 20 years. Well, here a couple of words about the project inside those programs. These are the projects realized in Yamal-Nenets autonomous area. Now, the good projects, compiling dictionaries, creation of the Atlas of Dialects, publication of folklore text, compiling school textbooks, organizing courses of advanced training of school teachers, organizing Olympic Games in minority languages for school children, translation texts of various kinds from Russian into minority languages. But again, all that concern, all those events, so to say, concern only very few people, those who really know the language no, as for the school, the results are really poor. And if children come to school without knowledge of the language, they leave school with just a couple of words, unfortunately. All right. I want to show this map because here we can see the budget of the territories. We can compare which territory is richer. Now, the territories which were spoken about. Here, Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Area, it is a very rich territory, as well as the Sakhalin region. As for Irkutsk region, it is its budget is pretty high, but not as high as there. Krasnoyarsk territory doesn't have as much money as the other three ones. And as for Tomsk region and Khabarovsk territory, their budget is low. The question is whether the programs somehow are connected, and the effectiveness of the programs supporting languages are somehow connected with the budget of the regions. Well, I think partly, not partly because the Yamalo-Nenets autonomous area is works best of all concerning the languages, but it might be not because they are rich and they give money to support the education and publishing books, but just because the Nenets residing there, fortunately kept their language and their language transmission. As for Khabarovsky region, the situation is really very dangerous because, and we see that only in some schools in the territory, the language is taught and so on. Well, of course, what is being done now is better than nothing, but well, the situation is grave up to now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your paper. And now it's time for questions. We have a few minutes for discussion, please. Ekaterina.
Yes, thank you very much. And just a comment in support of your discourse that, yes, for instance, Sakhalin area has a good lore, has a lot of money, publishes nowadays quite a lot of books, other activities are performed, but unfortunately the result is of course good in a sense that we have more data, more materials, but we do not see any direct correlation with the reestablishment of language transmission or things like that. So this is just yeah, the same what you were saying about. Yes.
Thank you.
More questions or comments? Yeah, I was interested to see that economy map that you showed just a couple of minutes ago. And I was surprised that, for example, Khanty-Mansiysk is not a high budget, but...
Well, is it? Wait a moment. No, not as high as Yamalo-Nenets, yes, but not low. It's just like Irkutskaya Oblast.
And can you see differences in the degree of activity in this domain between Khanty-Mansiysk and Yamalo-Nenetsk, for example?
Well, I think Yamalo-Nenets area of autonomous area is more active, a little bit more active. But Khanty-Mansiysk, they also try to do things, but Yamalo-Nenets is more active.
So there is indeed a correlation between the economic status and the degree of efforts applied here.
Yes, the degree of money investments. Yes, there is a correlation. It makes something, but not much, unfortunately.
Okay. Any more questions or comments? Let's thank Olga for her very interesting presentation.